The October morning was cold and gray when Sarah pulled into the courthouse parking lot in Portland, Oregon. The sky hung low and heavy, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Emma sat in the back seat of the Accord, her small frame barely visible above the booster seat. The 3-year-old wore a pale pink dress that Sarah had picked out 2 nights ago, hoping that looking pretty might somehow make her feel braver. It hadn't worked. Emma's pigtails bounced slightly as Sarah unbuckled her, but the girl's blue eyes remained distant, hollow, haunted by something no child should ever have to understand. "Come on, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, her own voice barely holding together. "We're going to see the judge today, remember? We talked about this." Emma didn't respond. She hadn't really spoken much in weeks, not since the separation became official, not since David moved out and the fighting escalated to something darker and more sinister. The silence from her daughter had become Sarah's greatest fear, more terrifying than any legal battle or custody hearing. Sarah lifted Emma from the car seat, settling the small child against her hip. Emma's arms wrapped around her mother's neck with an intensity that broke Sarah's heart. This wasn't the playful grip of a toddler seeking comfort. This was desperation. This was survival mode. This was a child clinging to the only stability she had left in a world that had crumbled into dust. The courthouse steps seemed impossibly long as they climbed them together. Sarah's attorney met them at the entrance, was a fierce woman in her 50s who had spent 2 decades fighting family law battles. She'd seen it all, the worst humanity had to offer in marriage dissolution cases, but even she seemed shaken by Emma's condition. "How is she today?" asked gently, kneeling down to look at Emma at eye level. Emma turned her face away, burying it in Sarah's shoulder. "Not talking much," Sarah said quietly. "She had nightmares again last night. 3 times I had to get up." His jaw tightened. The evaluations came back yesterday. They're damning for David. The psychologist noted significant signs of emotional abuse. The neglect allegations have documentation. We have this. But Sarah wasn't listening to the details of their legal advantage. She was watching her daughter, watching the way Emma had completely shut down, the way her body had gone rigid with tension. Emma used to be such a bright, talkative child. She used to sing constantly, ask endless questions about everything, laugh at the silliest things. That little girl felt like a ghost now, like she belonged to some other timeline where the world hadn't fallen apart. The marble floors of the courthouse entrance were cold and imposing. Their footsteps echoed in the vast corridor as they walked toward the family court section. Everything about the building screamed authority and judgment. The high ceilings, the stern-faced portraits of judges past, the official seals on every wall, it all communicated one message: serious things happen here. Lives change here. The powerful decide the fate of the powerless here. Sarah felt Emma's grip tighten even more. The child was terrified, and honestly, Sarah didn't blame her. Everything about this situation was terrifying. They passed through security, a metal detector and a bored security guard who barely glanced at them. Then they waited in a hallway outside the courtroom. Sarah sat on a hard wooden bench with Emma in her lap, rocking her slightly, humming a lullaby that used to soothe her daughter to sleep. It didn't work today. Emma remained tense, her small body vibrating with anxiety that Sarah could feel radiating off her in waves. Other families waited in the hallway too. A man with an angry expression stood near a water fountain, occasionally glancing back at a woman holding 2 young children. Dysfunction everywhere. Broken families everywhere. The courthouse seemed to be full of people whose lives had shattered beyond repair. Sarah wondered how many children like Emma were in this building today, terrified and confused, caught in the crossfire of adult decisions and adult anger. Returned with papers and a grim expression. David just arrived. He's in the courtroom with his attorney. They're claiming the neglect allegations are fabricated. They're denying everything. Sarah's stomach churned. Of course he was denying it. David had always been good at denial. He'd his drinking problem for years until it got so bad he couldn't hide it anymore. He'd his anger issues, his emotional outbursts, his increasingly unstable behavior. And now he would deny hurting their daughter, even though Emma's therapist had documented clear signs of emotional trauma. The courtroom doors loomed ahead, stood and extended her hand to help Sarah up. "It's time. Are you ready?" Sarah looked down at Emma, at her daughter's pale face and frightened eyes. She kissed the top of the girl's head. "We're going to be okay, baby. Mommy's right here." They entered the courtroom together. The room was larger than Sarah expected, with high ceilings and wood paneling that made her feel small and insignificant. The judge sat elevated at his bench, a stern-looking man in his 60s with gray hair and reading glasses. To the right sat David with his attorney, a slick man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd done this 1,000 times before. David's eyes met Sarah's for a brief moment, and she saw something in them she hadn't seen in months: desperation. He was losing control of the narrative, and he knew it. Emma clutched Sarah's hand so tightly her fingers hurt. The little girl's eyes were wide, taking in every detail of the courtroom. The bailiff, the court reporter, the judge, the opposing counsel. All of these powerful figures suddenly felt like they were surrounding her, pressing down on her small shoulders with the weight of their authority and judgment. "All rise," the bailiff announced, though everyone was already standing. "The Honorable Judge Robert presiding." The judge entered and took his seat. He looked tired already, as if he'd seen too many broken families, too many custody battles, too many children caught in the middle of adult warfare. His eyes scanned the room and landed on Emma. Something shifted in his expression. Maybe sympathy, maybe concern, maybe just the weight of understanding that this child's entire future depended on decisions he would make today. Sarah sat down, pulling Emma close. The little girl was trembling, began arranging her papers at the table. Across the room, David's attorney was already forming arguments, already preparing to fight, already gearing up for battle. And then, just as the judge was about to begin, the courtroom door opened. A man in a police uniform entered, and beside him walked a large German shepherd with intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor. Emma's head lifted slightly. For the first time that day, her death grip on Sarah's hand loosened just a fraction. Something was about to change everything. Officer stepped into the courtroom with the quiet confidence of someone who had walked into hundreds of difficult situations before. Behind him, on a red leather leash, was Scout, a 2-year-old German shepherd with a sleek black and tan coat that gleamed under the fluorescent courtroom lights. Scout's ears were alert, his eyes intelligent and aware, but his body language was relaxed and calm. He wasn't agitated or anxious. He was precisely what he'd been trained to be, a beacon of stability in chaos, a living embodiment of unconditional acceptance in a room full of judgment. Judge's stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. He nodded at Officer, a gesture of recognition and approval. This wasn't the first time the courthouse had utilized emotional support animals in family proceedings, but it never got old. The judge had personally reviewed the research on animal-assisted therapy in traumatic situations and had approved Scout's presence in his courtroom specifically for cases involving vulnerable children. Sarah felt the shift in the room's energy immediately. It was subtle but unmistakable, like someone had cracked a window and let fresh air into a stale, suffocating space. The tension that had been pressing down on her shoulders since the moment they arrived seemed to lift, just slightly. She looked down at Emma and noticed something extraordinary. Her daughter's rigid body had softened. The iron grip Emma had maintained on her mother's hand had relaxed almost imperceptibly. Her daughter's terrified eyes were no longer fixed on the judge or her father or the intimidating courtroom surroundings. They were locked on Scout. Officer guided Scout to a cushioned mat positioned near the witness stand, at an angle that allowed the dog to be present without being intrusive to the proceedings. Scout performed what looked like a perfect down command, his body sinking gracefully onto the mat. He arranged himself with his back legs stretched out and his front paws crossed, his chin resting on his paws. His dark brown eyes remained alert and observant, scanning the room slowly, taking in every person, every emotion, every undercurrent of tension. It was as if Scout could sense the pain in the room and had positioned himself as a silent witness to the suffering. David's expensive attorney suddenly looked uncomfortable. He shifted in his chair, his polished appearance and confident demeanor momentarily disrupted by the presence of an animal. "Your Honor," he began, "I'm not sure the relevance of—" Judge raised a hand. "Counsel, this court has approved the use of emotional support animals in this proceeding. You received notification of this 2 weeks ago. The dog stays." The attorney sat back down, his jaw clenched. He clearly didn't like variables he couldn't control, and a dog was definitely a variable. Animals didn't follow legal arguments or get rattled by aggressive questioning. Animals couldn't be manipulated or confused by clever wordplay. They existed in a realm of pure authenticity that made people like David's attorney deeply uncomfortable. But Scout's impact on Emma was undeniable. Sarah watched as her daughter's shoulders dropped, as her breathing became slightly less shallow and panicked. Emma wasn't looking at Scout with fear. She was looking at him with something that resembled curiosity, the first real emotion beyond pure terror that Sarah had seen from her daughter in what felt like forever. Leaned over and whispered to Sarah, "This is good, really good. Scout can reach her where we can't." Sarah nodded, but she was too focused on watching Emma to respond. Her daughter was still watching the dog, her blue eyes tracking Scout's every movement. The German Shepherd's tail wagged slowly once, twice, a gentle acknowledgement of Emma's attention. It was as if Scout understood that somewhere in that small, terrified girl, there was a child desperately seeking a lifeline, and Scout had decided he would be that lifeline. Judge looked at the clock and then back at the assembled parties. "Before we begin, I want to explain the presence of Officer and Scout. This dog is trained specifically for situations involving traumatized witnesses or vulnerable individuals. Research indicates that animals can facilitate emotional communication in ways that traditional dialogue sometimes cannot. Officer will remain present throughout these proceedings." David's attorney started to object again, but the judge's sharp look silenced him before he could form words. The courtroom had transformed into something different now. Yes, the tension was still present. Yes, the conflict was still real. Yes, the stakes for Emma's future remained impossibly high. But there was something else now, a calming presence that seemed to whisper to everyone in the room, "You are not alone in this suffering. Something here understands pain and is willing to sit with it." Sarah felt tears threatening to spill from her eyes. She'd brought Emma to this courtroom terrified that her daughter would completely fall apart, that the trauma and fear would be too much for a 3-year-old to endure. She'd imagined Emma screaming, crying, shutting down completely. And while Emma was still clearly frightened, there was now something else, a thin thread of connection to something gentle and non-threatening. Scout represented a break from the conflict, a reminder that safety still existed somewhere in this frightening world. Judge adjusted his glasses and shuffled through his papers. "We'll begin with opening statements from both counsel, but first, I want to note for the record that the presence of Officer and Scout has been approved as part of this court's commitment to prioritizing the vulnerable parties. The dog will remain present throughout these proceedings." As the judge spoke, Emma's hand found Sarah's again, but this time it was different. The grip was still tight, but it wasn't the death grip of pure panic. It was the grip of a child seeking comfort while also being comforted by something she didn't have words for. Scout had given Emma permission to feel safer. The dog existed in absolute acceptance, completely unconcerned with right or wrong, guilt or innocence, winning or losing. Scout simply was present, calm, stable. Stood to deliver her opening statement. She outlined the neglect allegations, the documented signs of emotional abuse, the psychological evaluations that supported Sarah's case. But as she spoke, Sarah noticed that Emma wasn't looking at her mother's attorney or the opposing counsel or the judge. Emma's eyes remained fixed on Scout. Even at 3 years old, instinct was guiding her toward the source of safety and stability in the room. Officer caught Sarah's eye briefly and offered a small, knowing nod. He'd seen this pattern hundreds of times before. Animals didn't judge. They didn't argue. They didn't weaponize pain for legal advantage. They simply held space for suffering and offered presence without demands. Scout was doing exactly what he was trained to do, creating a safe container for Emma's emotions, teaching her through his very presence that it was possible to feel scared and still be okay. David's attorney began his opening statement, his voice smooth and confident, full of legal jargon and carefully constructed arguments designed to undermine Sarah's credibility. But Emma didn't listen. She watched Scout. And Scout, in his infinite canine wisdom, continued to simply lie on his mat, his presence a silent declaration that this child was safe, that her fear was being witnessed and honored, and that she was not alone. The stage was set. The battle was about to begin, but something in that courtroom had fundamentally shifted the moment Scout entered, and Sarah knew, with absolute certainty, that this dog would change everything about how this custody hearing unfolded. Stood slowly, her navy suit immaculate, her gray hair pulled back in a professional bun. She adjusted her reading glasses and began with the first witness, Doctor, the child psychologist who had evaluated Emma 2 weeks prior. Doctor was a petite woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an air of authority that came from 20 years of working with traumatized children. She took the oath with her hand on the Bible, her voice steady and professional. Doctor began, "Could you please describe the behavioral and emotional symptoms you observed in Emma during your evaluation?" Doctor nodded solemnly. The child presented with clear markers of complex trauma. She exhibited extreme anxiety, difficulty with eye contact, withdrawal from social engagement, and what I would characterize as emotional dissociation. These symptoms are consistent with prolonged exposure to an unstable, unpredictable environment. David's attorney stood. Objection to the characterization. That's speculation about the cause of her symptoms. Sustained, judge ruled. Doctor, please stick to what you observed, not your theories about causation. But had already planted the seed. The judge had heard trauma, anxiety, dissociation. The narrative was being established. For the next 40 minutes, systematically built her case. She presented documentation from Emma's preschool noting behavioral changes after David's visits. She introduced text messages between Sarah and David, where he explicitly threatened to take Emma away if Sarah continued to keep her from him. She presented an incident report from the pediatrician, noting Emma's weight loss and increased anxiety. Each piece of evidence was a brick in the wall of proof that David's behavior was harmful to Emma. Then David's attorney stood. His name was Richard, and he was exactly the kind of lawyer who thrived on courtroom combat. He was tall, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to calculate every angle. He'd spent his entire career defending people accused of things they insisted they hadn't done. He began his cross-examination with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Doctor, isn't it true that children can exhibit these symptoms for many reasons? Divorce itself is traumatic. Separation from a parent is traumatic. Couldn't Emma's symptoms be caused by the simple fact that her parents are no longer together? Doctor shook her head. The severity and specificity of her presentation goes beyond standard divorce adjustment. She's exhibiting symptoms consistent with emotional abuse and neglect. But you've never personally witnessed Mr. engaging in any abusive behavior, have you? No, but that's all I need. No further questions. Sarah watched as called witness after witness. The school counselor, the pediatrician, a neighbor who had heard David screaming at Emma through the walls of his apartment. Each witness provided a piece of the puzzle, each one adding weight to Sarah's narrative. But Emma sat silently through it all, her small body curled against her mother, her eyes occasionally glancing at Scout but mostly remaining distant and disconnected. Then David took the stand. He wore a blue button-down shirt and khaki pants, clothes carefully selected to present an image of respectability and wholesomeness. His attorney had clearly coached him. He spoke calmly and deliberately, his voice measured and reasonable. The allegations of yelling. He explained that Emma's anxiety was natural for a child going through a divorce. He claimed that Sarah had been poisoning Emma against him, keeping her from their relationship, using false accusations to gain leverage in the custody battle. "Emma loves me," David said, his voice trembling with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "I would never hurt my daughter. This entire case is based on lies designed to keep me from my child." Sarah felt her stomach churn. He was good at this. He'd always been good at lying. He'd lied about his drinking for years. He'd lied about his affairs. He'd lied about his anger until it became impossible to deny. Now he was lying under oath, and his calm, collected demeanor was working. She could see it in the judge's expression, some doubt, some uncertainty. Richard continued the attack. "Ms., do you have any direct evidence that Mr. has ever struck, abused, or deliberately harmed Emma?" "No," admitted, "but the psychological impact." "And has Mr. ever been arrested or charged with any crime?" "No." "Has he ever been reported to Child Protective Services?" "There have been concerns raised by." "Yes or no, Ms.? Has he ever been officially reported to CPS and found to be in violation?" His jaw tightened. "No." It was an illegal manipulation, was systematically dismantling the emotional evidence by pointing out the absence of concrete proof. Emotional abuse was hard to prove. Psychological damage could be attributed to multiple causes. Without direct evidence of physical abuse or an official CPS finding, everything became circumstantial. The courtroom felt suffocating. Sarah felt despair rising in her chest. What if the judge didn't believe her? What if David won? What if Emma had to spend significant time with a man whose emotional instability was clearly traumatizing her? Then something extraordinary happened. Emma suddenly stood up from her seat. Her small body went rigid. She made a noise, not quite a word, but a desperate sound of protest or distress. Sarah reached for her, but Emma was looking away from her mother. She was looking at Scout. The courtroom fell silent. Everyone turned to look at the 3-year-old, who had been completely silent throughout the entire proceeding. Scout's head lifted off his paws. His ears perked up. He remained lying down on his mat, but his entire body seemed to come alive with attention. His dark eyes fixed on Emma with an intensity that transcended the normal human-animal connection. He seemed to understand that this child was in crisis, that something in Emma was trying to break free from the prison of fear and silence. Judge put his papers down. "Let's take a recess," he announced. 20 minutes, everyone back here at 2 o'clock. The bailiff called for everyone to stand. Lawyers began packing papers. Court reporters shut down their machines. But Sarah remained frozen, watching her daughter. Emma had begun to cry silently, tears streaming down her small face, her eyes still locked on Scout. Put a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Something just happened," she whispered. "Something important." Sarah wasn't sure what her daughter was experiencing, but she knew with absolute certainty that Emma was trying to communicate something. The testimony had been useless. The evidence had been challenged. But Emma's body was speaking a language that went deeper than words. "Come on, baby," Sarah whispered, lifting her daughter into her arms. "Let's go outside for a minute." As they walked toward the courtroom doors, Emma's hand extended backward, reaching toward Scout. The dog watched them go, his intelligent eyes tracking the little girl until she disappeared through the doorway. Officer noticed it and made a note in his pocket notebook. The afternoon session was about to begin, but something fundamental had shifted in the courtroom. The judge had seen something in Emma's reaction that no amount of legal argument could produce, the truth of a child's terror. And that truth was about to change everything. Sarah carried Emma through the heavy courtroom doors and into the hallway. The marble corridor suddenly felt colder, more institutional, more overwhelmingly lonely. Emma's small body was trembling, not from cold but from some internal storm of emotion that a 3-year-old's mind couldn't possibly process. Sarah set her daughter down on a bench near a window overlooking the courthouse gardens, the gray Portland sky stretching endlessly above them. "It's okay, baby," Sarah whispered, kneeling down to Emma's eye level. "You're doing so good, you're being so brave." But Emma wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on the courtroom doors, her small body leaning toward them as if pulled by an invisible force. Her lips were moving slightly, though no sound emerged. She was rehearsing something, Sarah realized, preparing herself, building courage for something she desperately needed to do. Appeared beside them, her attorney's mask temporarily slipping. "She's trying to communicate something," said quietly. "I've seen this before with traumatized children. They shut down in the presence of authority figures, but sometimes an external object, or in this case, an animal, can become a bridge, a safe intermediary." Sarah didn't fully understand the terminology, but she understood the meaning. Emma needed something other than words. Emma needed permission to express what her voice couldn't articulate. Emma needed Scout. "Come on, sweetheart," Sarah said softly, taking her daughter's hand. "Let's go back inside." They re-entered the courtroom during the recess period. Most of the lawyers and court staff were in the hallway, discussing the case in hushed tones. The courtroom felt almost peaceful in their absence, the tension temporarily suspended. Scout remained on his mat, exactly where he'd been left, but his head lifted the moment Emma appeared in the doorway. Officer had been sitting nearby, reviewing his notes, but he immediately looked up. His eyes met Sarah's for just a moment, and in that glance passed an understanding between them. Something was about to happen, something important. Emma's hand slipped from Sarah's. The little girl took a tentative step forward, then another. Her small feet barely made a sound on the carpeted floor as she walked toward Scout. Sarah held her breath. She felt tears threatening to spill from her eyes but willed them back. Her daughter was trying. After weeks of silence and withdrawal, Emma was trying. Scout remained perfectly still as Emma approached, respecting the child's pace, understanding through his training and his instincts that this moment required complete stillness. As Emma got closer, the dog's tail began to wag slowly, a gentle acknowledgement of the child's courage. Emma reached out with one small hand and touched Scout's head. Her fingers barely grazed the dog's soft fur, but it seemed to unlock something inside her. A tremor ran through her tiny body. Her other hand came up, and suddenly both small hands were buried in Scout's neck fur, her face pressed against the dog's shoulder. Officer stood slowly, moving with deliberate quietness. Sarah remained frozen on the other side of the courtroom, watching her daughter with a heart that felt like it might break into pieces. Stood beside Sarah, equally still, equally silent. Everyone understood, this was sacred ground. This was a child finding her voice through connection. Scout's body relaxed completely. The dog seemed to settle into the moment, understanding with an almost preternatural awareness that this little girl needed to be held by his presence. His ear tilted slightly, angling toward Emma's face. And then it happened. Emma whispered something. Her voice was so small, so quiet, that only Scout could hear it clearly. But Officer had moved closer, his trained attention focused entirely on the child. He leaned in slightly, positioning himself to hear Emma's words without intruding on the sacred space she'd created with Scout. Emma whispered again, her voice trembling, "Daddy's scared." Officer's expression shifted. His eyes widened slightly, and he raised his notebook, his professional instincts kicking in. Emma repeated the words, her voice getting slightly stronger, as if saying them once had created a path for them to travel again. "Daddy scared, Daddy scared." Sarah felt the words like a physical blow. Not "Daddy hurt me," not "Daddy yelled," not "Daddy hit me." Just two simple words that somehow contained more truth than hours of testimony could provide. Scout nuzzled Emma gently, his dark eyes full of what looked like compassion. The dog seemed to understand that he just helped a child do something extraordinary, tell the truth. Officer approached slowly, reverently, his notebook in hand. "Emma," he said softly, his voice gentle and non-threatening, "can you tell me about your daddy being scared?" Emma lifted her head from Scout's fur. Her blue eyes were wet with tears, but there was something different in them now. A small spark of relief, as if saying the words out loud had loosened the chains that had held her captive for weeks. "Daddy scared," Emma repeated, this time with more conviction. "Daddy yells, Daddy scared." Sarah felt understanding crash over her like a wave. David had told her countless times during their marriage that he suffered from anxiety, that his anger was a response to fear, that he was terrified of losing control. But he'd never sought treatment. He'd self-medicated with alcohol. And Emma, sensitive, perceptive Emma, had somehow internalized her father's internal terror as her own. Officer continued speaking to Emma in the gentlest voice imaginable. "Are you scared of your daddy?" Emma shook her head. Daddy scared inside. The wisdom of a 3-year-old. The raw, unfiltered truth that no lawyer, no judge, no expert witness could manufacture. Emma wasn't afraid of David being mean to her. She was afraid of his fear itself. She was traumatized by his emotional instability, by his inability to manage his own internal chaos. Scout's tail continued to wag slowly, a steady rhythm that seemed to anchor Emma to the present moment, to safety, to the knowledge that something understood her pain. Touched Sarah's arm. "That just changed everything," she whispered. "That statement, unsolicited and genuine, just changed the entire trajectory of this case." Sarah couldn't respond. She was watching her daughter, watching the way Emma leaned into Scout's body, watching the way the dog seemed to understand that he just facilitated something monumentally important. Emma had found her voice, not through force, not through pressure, but through unconditional acceptance and connection. Judge appeared in the courtroom doorway. He'd apparently stepped out to get coffee and had stopped, frozen, observing the scene before him. He said nothing, but his eyes took in everything: the terrified child, the support dog, the police officer taking notes, and the truth that was silently radiating from this moment of connection. The judge looked at Officer, who turned and met his gaze. Without words, they communicated. This was it. This was the breakthrough that changed everything. Officer knelt down beside Emma and Scout. "Emma, thank you for being so brave," he said softly. "You've helped us understand something really important." Emma nodded, her small hand still buried in Scout's fur. She'd said everything she needed to say. The rest would be up to the adults, but she'd done it. Against all odds, against weeks of trauma and fear, she'd found her voice. And Scout had been the bridge that made it possible. The recess ended with the bailiff announcing that court would resume in 5 minutes. Sarah had returned to her seat, still processing what had just occurred. Emma sat beside her, her small body no longer rigid with terror but visibly calmer, as if speaking those 2 words had released pressure from an invisible valve. Scout had been guided back to his mat by Officer, though the dog's eyes continued to track Emma's movements around the room. Judge took his place on the bench. The lawyers returned, David's attorney looking confused about the recess extension, unclear about what had transpired during his absence. The judge began reviewing his notes, seemingly preparing to resume the testimony, but then Officer rose and quietly approached the judge's bench. "Your Honor," Officer said respectfully, "I have information relevant to this proceeding that emerged during the recess. I request permission to submit an informal statement." The judge looked up, studying the officer with interest. Richard immediately objected. "Your Honor, any communication between the witness and the officer is hearsay and inadmissible." But Judge held up a hand. "Counsel, Officer is here in an official capacity as a support resource, not as a fact witness. I'll hear what he has to say. This is preliminary to the record." He looked at. No objection from the mother's counsel. shook her head. None, Your Honor. We welcome officer's observations. Judge gestured to officer. You may proceed. Officer stepped forward, his demeanor professional but with an underlying gravity that made it clear this was significant. During the recess, I observed a spontaneous communication between the child, Emma, and Scout. The child approached the dog of her own volition, and without any prompting or suggestion, expressed a concern that I believe is central to this case. David's attorney started to stand, but the judge silenced him with a look. Officer continued, consulting his notes. The child stated, and I quote, "Daddy scared, Daddy scared." When asked to elaborate, she explained that her father yells and is scared inside. The courtroom fell absolutely silent. David's face had gone pale. Sarah felt her heart begin to race, reached over and squeezed her hand. Officer went on. In my professional experience with emotionally traumatized children, what I observed was a child attempting to communicate something she could not verbalize through traditional means. This statement, unsolicited and spontaneous, reveals the child's perception of the root cause of her trauma. It's not abuse in the traditional sense. It's exposure to an adult's unmanaged emotional dysregulation. Objection, Richard said, his voice sharp. The officer is testifying as an expert without qualification. Sustained, the judge ruled. Officer, please confine yourself to what you observed, not your interpretations. Yes, Your Honor, officer said. I observed a 3-year-old child spontaneously state that her father is scared and that his yelling is connected to his fear. I documented this statement in real time. He held up his notebook as evidence. Judge nodded thoughtfully. Officer returned to his seat. The judge looked at David directly. Mister, do you wish to respond? David's attorney grabbed his arm, but David stood anyway. He looked shaken, genuinely shaken. Your Honor, the child is confused. I don't know what she means. I've never told her I was scared. I would never. Please, the judge interrupted. You may respond through your counsel. Sit down. But the damage was done. In that moment of David's confusion and defensive reaction, something shifted in the courtroom's collective understanding. The judge had seen something in David's response that confirmed what Emma had communicated. The judge announced, "We'll take another recess while I consider the implications of this new information. Court will resume in 30 minutes." As people began to disperse, Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. Officer. He guided her quietly away from the courtroom, away from the lawyers and judges and institutional machinery of justice. They ended up in a small conference room on the second floor. Sarah, officer said gently, closing the door behind them, I need to tell you something important about what Emma communicated, and I need to do this away from the courtroom dynamics. Sarah nodded, her hands trembling slightly. Officer sat across from her at the small table. Emma didn't say her father hurt her or that he hit her or that he was mean to her. She said her father is scared. She said he yells and is scared inside. Do you understand what that means? Sarah's throat tightened. She's picking up on his anxiety. Exactly, officer said. Children are incredibly perceptive. They absorb the emotional climates of their environments like sponges. David's emotional dysregulation, his anxiety, his anger, his loss of control, these things are terrifying Emma, not because he's intentionally abusing her, but because she's sensitive to his internal chaos. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. Years of marriage to David suddenly made sense through this new lens. His panic attacks, his sudden mood swings, his inability to manage his own emotions, his drinking as a coping mechanism. She'd always known something was wrong, but she'd never articulated it this way. This isn't about David being a bad person, officer continued. This is about David being an unwell person whose untreated mental health condition is affecting his daughter. That's actually a different issue entirely from abuse or neglect. But what does it mean for the custody arrangement? Sarah asked. Officer leaned back in his chair. That's not for me to say, that's the judge's decision. But what I can tell you is that the judge is going to see this not as a question of bad father versus good mother, but as a question of what environment will allow this child to heal, and what support does David need to become a parent his daughter can feel safe around. Sarah nodded slowly, absorbing this. In some ways, it was harder than if David had been outright abusive, because this meant the solution wasn't simply removing Emma from David's presence. The solution required David to get help. The solution required change from David. The solution required him to confront his own demons. Emma was very brave today, Officer said softly. She found a way to communicate something that was locked inside her. Scout gave her permission to express it, but now the adults have to do the hard work of hearing what she was really saying. What do you think the judge will do? Sarah asked. Officer stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Portland skyline. I think the judge understands now that this case isn't about winning or losing. It's about healing. All three of them, Sarah, David, and Emma, need healing. And sometimes that requires a different kind of justice than what courtrooms typically deliver. He turned back to face Sarah. The judge will likely require David to seek professional help, but more importantly, the judge will recognize that your daughter needs her father to get well. That's what Emma was really saying when she whispered those two words into Scout's ear. My daddy is scared and it's scaring me. Sarah buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. Her ex-husband wasn't a monster. He was a broken man who'd been breaking their daughter. And somehow, that realization was both more complicated and more hopeful than she'd expected. Come on, Officer said gently, offering his hand. The judge is waiting, and there's more that needs to happen today. But now, everyone understands what this case is really about. As they walked back toward the courtroom, Sarah realized that Scout had done more than comfort a traumatized child. The dog had diagnosed the real problem, and now the real healing could begin. When court reconvened, there was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air. Judge seemed different, more thoughtful, more deliberate. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at the assembled parties. Sarah sat beside, her heart pounding. Emma was in the care of a court-appointed supervising guardian in a room down the hall. She wouldn't be present for the ruling. David and his attorney sat rigidly across the aisle. Before I issue my ruling, Judge began, his voice carrying the weight of his years on the bench, I want to make a statement about what has transpired in this courtroom today. This case initially presented itself as a standard custody dispute. Both parents claimed to want what was best for the child. Both presented evidence. Both offered competing narratives, but nothing in that traditional framework gave me clear insight into what was actually happening in this child's life. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the courtroom. Then Officer and Scout arrived, and by the end of this proceeding, a 3-year-old child communicated more truth to this court than hours of adult testimony could provide. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The judge continued, the child's statement, "Daddy scared," is not a claim of abuse in the traditional legal sense. It's not an accusation of violence or willful neglect. It's something more subtle and, frankly, more complex. It's a child's observation that her father's emotional dysregulation is creating an environment of fear and instability that is harmful to her. Judge leaned forward slightly. Mister, I want you to understand something. I don't believe you are intentionally trying to harm your daughter. I believe you are a man struggling with significant anxiety and emotional management issues that have created consequences you may not fully understand. That doesn't absolve you of responsibility, but it does change how this court should respond. David looked stunned. His attorney whispered something in his ear, but David's eyes were fixed on the judge. Therefore, Judge announced, this court is issuing the following ruling. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Primary physical custody of Emma will remain with her mother, Sarah. However, Visitation rights for the father will be maintained at supervised levels until such time as he completes certain court-ordered requirements. Squeezed Sarah's hand. First, the judge continued, Mr. is ordered to undergo a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation by a licensed mental health professional within 14 days. This evaluation should specifically address anxiety disorders, anger management deficits, and any other relevant mental health conditions. Second, Mr. will be ordered to complete a minimum of 6 months of intensive therapy addressing his diagnosed conditions. He will provide this court with progress reports from his treating therapist every 30 days. Third, Mr. will complete a court-approved anger management program, consisting of a minimum of 20 sessions. David's attorney started to stand, but the judge raised his hand. I'm not finished. Fourth, judge went on, both parents will participate in co-parenting counseling with a licensed family therapist. This counseling will focus on creating a stable, predictable environment for Emma and teaching both parents effective communication strategies that do not involve conflict in the child's presence. Fifth, Emma will receive trauma-informed therapy with particular emphasis on helping her process her experiences and emotions. Officer has indicated that emotional support animal-assisted therapy has proven effective in her case, and I am authorizing continued access to Scout through the courthouse program as part of her treatment plan. Sarah felt tears of relief streaming down her face. This wasn't punishment, this was healing. But then Judge said something that made the entire courtroom fall silent. I also want to address the role that Officer and Scout have played in this proceeding. Their presence has fundamentally changed how I understand this case. Research has demonstrated that animal-assisted therapy can unlock emotional communication in traumatized individuals, particularly children, in ways that traditional methods cannot. Therefore, I am making a formal recommendation to the state court system that emotional support animal programs be expanded and funded in all family law courtrooms across Oregon. He looked directly at Officer. Officer, your work today has not only impacted this family, it has demonstrated to this court the profound value of these programs. I intend to write a formal letter to the State Judicial Council recommending additional resources for your program and programs like it. Officer nodded, visibly moved. Judge turned back to the parties. However, I want to be clear about something. This ruling is not about Mr. being a bad father. It's about recognizing that unhealed wounds create wounded parents, and wounded parents create traumatized children. The goal of this court is not to punish Mr. The goal is to create the conditions under which he can heal and become the father his daughter needs. He adjusted his glasses. Mr., you have an opportunity here, a real opportunity to address the issues that are affecting not only your relationship with your daughter, but also your quality of life. The court is offering you a pathway to healing. I strongly encourage you to take it seriously. David nodded slowly, his face a mixture of emotions, shame, relief, determination. Ms., the judge addressed Sarah, you have been a strong advocate for your daughter. I want to acknowledge that. However, part of the co-parenting counseling will also involve helping you communicate with your daughter's father in ways that support his healing while maintaining healthy boundaries. Healing is a two-way street. Sarah nodded. She understood. This wasn't about winning. This was about everyone getting better. In terms of visitation, Judge continued, Mr. will have supervised visitation beginning immediately, 2 hours, twice per week, in a therapeutic setting where a trained professional is present. After 4 months, if the therapist confirms that Mr. is making genuine progress with his treatment, we will revisit this arrangement and potentially increase unsupervised visitation. Additionally, the judge said, visitation will include Emma's access to therapeutic support, either through Officer's program or a comparable resource. The child's healing is paramount to all other considerations. Judge then did something unexpected. He looked at Scout, who lay calmly on his mat, seemingly unconcerned with the legal proceedings swirling around him. "I also want to acknowledge Scout," the judge said, a slight smile crossing his stern face. "This dog, through his presence and his training, has given voice to a voiceless child. That is the highest calling of justice, giving voice to those who cannot speak for themselves. Scout has done that today. Officer, please make sure that dog knows he's earned the gratitude of this court." There was a soft ripple of emotion through the courtroom, a few quiet chuckles, but mostly just deep recognition of something profound. "In conclusion," Judge said, "this case is adjourned pending compliance with the court's orders. The next hearing will be scheduled for 4 months from today to assess progress. If all parties are complying with the therapeutic requirements and progress is being made, we will consider modifications to the custody and visitation arrangement." He banged his gavel gently. "This court recognizes that healing takes time. Let's give these people the opportunity to heal. Court is adjourned." The bailiff stood. "All rise." Sarah Felt's arm around her. Across the aisle, David sat with his head in his hands. And on his mat, Scout's tail wagged slowly, as if the dog understood that he'd just witnessed the triumph of compassion over vengeance. For the first time since this custody battle began, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in months: hope. Real, tangible hope that her family, all of them, including David, might actually heal. 6 months after Judge's ruling, David sat in Dr. Elizabeth Warner's office for his 37th therapy session. The psychiatrist's initial evaluation had diagnosed him with generalized anxiety disorder, and what she termed emotion dysregulation syndrome, a condition where his brain's amygdala was essentially stuck in overdrive, constantly perceiving threats even when none existed. His childhood trauma, his father's emotional absence, his mother's hypervigilance, all of it had conspired to create an adult man living in a state of perpetual fear. But something was beginning to shift. "Tell me about your visit with Emma last week," Dr. Warner said, adjusting her notes. David leaned back in his chair, a small smile crossing his face. "I took her to the park. We didn't do much, just sat on a bench and watched ducks. She asked me why I used to yell. I told her the truth. I told her that I was scared a lot, and sometimes when I'm scared I get angry. And I told her that it wasn't her fault, that I'm working on feeling less scared." Dr. Warner nodded. "How did she respond?" "She said, 'Daddy, the scary goes away when Scout is there.' She's wise, that girl, 3 years old and wiser than I am." Dr. Warner smiled. "She's also very perceptive. She's been observing you, watching to see if you're really changing. Children can sense authenticity. They know when an adult is genuinely committed to transformation." David wiped his eyes. He'd been crying more in the past 6 months than he had in the previous 35 years, but it felt like healing rather than weakness. Meanwhile, across town, Emma sat beside Scout in Officer's office. The little girl, now approaching her 4th birthday, was a different child than the one who had entered the courthouse 9 months ago. Her eyes held light again. Her smile came easily. She laughed. She asked questions. She was becoming herself again. "Emma," Officer said gently, "can you tell Scout about your week?" Emma reached over and wrapped her arms around Scout's neck. "Daddy didn't yell this week. Daddy was happy. He told me about when he was little and his daddy was mean to him. He cried. But Scout says crying is good, right, Officer?" "That's right," Officer confirmed. "Crying helps people heal." Scout nuzzled Emma's face, and the little girl giggled, a sound that had become increasingly common. Sarah sat in the co-parenting counseling session with David, something that would have seemed impossible a year ago. Their therapist, Michael Torres, was a specialist in family systems and helping divorced parents maintain functional relationships for their children's sake. "I want to acknowledge something," Michael said, looking at both of them. "What you two are doing here is incredibly difficult. You've built up years of anger, resentment, and hurt, but you're choosing to work through it for your daughter's benefit. That's courageous." Sarah nodded, and she noticed David doing the same. They'd found a new rhythm, not as romantic partners but as co-parents united by their commitment to Emma's healing. It wasn't natural. It required constant intentionality, but it was working. "The anger management group has been helpful," David said. "I'm learning techniques to manage my anxiety before it turns into rage, and I've connected with other men in the group who have similar issues. It helps to know I'm not alone in this struggle." Sarah found herself feeling something unexpected: compassion for her ex-husband. He was genuinely trying. Every day, he was fighting demons she now understood had been tormenting him for decades. 3 months after the court ruling, Emma's supervised visitation with David had been extended to 4 hours, twice per week. The supervising therapist had reported that David's interactions with Emma were increasingly calm and consistent. More importantly, Emma was no longer anxious during these visits. She was actually excited to see her father. Sarah watched from the observation window of the supervised visitation center as David sat on the floor with Emma, building blocks together. Her ex-husband, the man she'd feared and hated and blamed for her daughter's trauma, was gently helping their child construct a tower. "Daddy, look," Emma exclaimed. "It's almost as tall as Scout." David laughed, a genuine, warm laugh. "It sure is, sweetheart, that's wonderful." Sarah felt tears on her cheeks. This wasn't what she'd expected. She'd expected bitter custody battles to extend for years. She'd expected Emma to remain traumatized and withdrawn. She'd expected David to fight every ruling and resist every therapeutic intervention. But instead, he was doing the work. He was actually changing. 6 months into his therapy, David had begun attending a men's support group for anxiety disorders. He'd started medication, something he'd resisted for years, and found that the combination of therapy and treatment was giving him tools to manage the fear that had dominated his life. He still had difficult days, but they were becoming fewer and farther between. Emma's trauma therapy with Scout was also showing remarkable progress. Dr. Sarah, Emma's child psychologist, had documented significant improvements in the little girl's anxiety levels, her ability to express emotions verbally, and her capacity for healthy relationships. Scout had become more than a support animal. The dog had become Emma's gateway back to trust, back to safety, back to the world. During one particularly moving session, Emma had said something that made Doctor pause. "Scout taught me that people can be scared inside but still be good. Like Daddy. Daddy is scared inside, but he's good." At 3 years old, Emma had demonstrated a level of emotional intelligence and forgiveness that most adults never achieve. 9 months after the court ruling, Judge scheduled a progress review hearing. When it came time to report on the case, the news was overwhelmingly positive. David's therapist reported that his anxiety symptoms had decreased by 60%. His anger management instructor reported that he'd missed not a single session and was implementing the techniques consistently. His co-parenting counselor reported that he and Sarah were communicating effectively and prioritizing Emma's needs. Emma's therapist reported that the child's trauma symptoms had largely resolved. She was sleeping through the night. She was engaging socially with peers. She was laughing and playing normally for a child her age. "Your Honor," Judge's clerk announced at the hearing, "the court recommends unsupervised visitation be reinstated. Both parents are demonstrating genuine commitment to the therapeutic process, and the child appears to be thriving." Judge looked at David. "Mister, you've done the work. I'm impressed. More importantly, your daughter is happy and healing. That's the mark of true success." He looked at Sarah. "Ms., you've demonstrated grace and wisdom in supporting your daughter's relationship with her father, even as he's this transformation. That speaks to your character." And then he looked at Officer, who was present in the courtroom. "Officer, Scout continues to be a resource for families in this courthouse. I hope you see in this case the power of what you're doing. You didn't just help one family. You've created a model that will help hundreds more. After the hearing concluded, Sarah found herself standing in the courthouse hallway with David. They didn't embrace. That would have been inappropriate, but they looked at each other with something that resembled peace. "Thank you," David said quietly, "for fighting for what Emma needed, even when it meant fighting against me." Sarah nodded. "Thank you for fighting for yourself, for choosing to heal." Emma appeared from the courtroom holding Officer's hand. When she saw both parents, she ran toward them, not anxiously but joyfully. Sarah and David knelt down, and Emma threw her arms around them both. "Mommy, Daddy, and Scout all together," Emma announced happily. Scout trotted over and rested his head on Emma's shoulder, completing the circle. In that moment, standing in a courthouse hallway with her ex-husband and their daughter and a dog who had changed everything, Sarah understood something profound. Healing wasn't about winning. It was about transformation. It was about broken people choosing to become whole not for themselves, but for the people they loved. 3 years after that pivotal courtroom moment, Emma stood in front of her second-grade class at Lincoln Elementary School with a drawing in her hands. Her teacher had assigned a project. Draw a moment that changed your life. Emma was 7 now, confident, articulate, and remarkably well-adjusted for a child who had experienced such early trauma. "This is Scout," Emma announced to her classmates, holding up her drawing of a German Shepherd sitting beside a little girl. "Scout is a dog that helped me when I was sad. He helped me tell the truth even though I was scared." Her classmates listened with the open curiosity of second graders. Emma's teacher, Mrs., noticed that Emma didn't shy away from talking about her feelings or her past. She was healing in real time, and more importantly, she was helping other children understand that it was okay to talk about difficult things. Emma's drawing was photographed and sent to Officer, who still worked with Scout at the courthouse. But now, Scout wasn't just working in one courthouse. He was working in 17 courthouses across Oregon, and the program was expanding to Washington and California. Judge Robert had kept his promise. He'd written a formal letter to the State Judicial Council documenting the effectiveness of animal-assisted therapy in family court proceedings. He'd provided detailed case studies, psychological research, and outcome data. The letter concluded with this statement: "The presence of emotional support animals in family courtrooms has not only improved outcomes for vulnerable witnesses, it has fundamentally changed how we think about justice. Justice is not about winners and losers. Justice is about healing and transformation." That letter had sparked something. Within 2 years, 12 additional courthouses had implemented animal-assisted therapy programs. Within 3 years, it was 17. By year 5, it would expand to 43 courthouses across 4 states. The impact was staggering. Families who might have spent years in bitter custody battles found healing instead. Children who might have remained traumatized discovered voice and agency. And more importantly, the court system was beginning to recognize that its primary obligation wasn't punishing wrongdoing. It was protecting the vulnerable and facilitating healing. Officer had become something of a celebrity in judicial circles. He'd been invited to speak at the National Judicial Conference. He'd published research papers on the efficacy of animal-assisted therapy in legal proceedings. And Scout had become something approaching a legend, the dog who had changed family law. Scout's picture hung in 17 courthouses across the region. A plaque beneath each photo read, "Scout, helping traumatized children find their voices since 2019, in recognition of the power of unconditional presence and authentic connection." 4 years after the initial ruling, David stood in a conference room at a mental health facility in Portland. He was 39 years old, and for the first time in his adult life, he felt genuinely at peace. He'd been promoted to a supervisory position at his company, a promotion he attributed directly to his improved emotional regulation and interpersonal skills. His therapist had suggested that he might want to give back, to help other men dealing with similar issues. Today, David was starting his own support group for men with anxiety disorders. He'd partnered with Dr. Elizabeth Warner, Emma's original therapist, to create a structured program that combined cognitive behavioral therapy with peer support. His first group had 12 men, ages 25 to 63, all dealing with the same underlying issue: unmanaged anxiety manifesting as anger. "I'm here today," David told the group, "because I was a broken man who didn't know he was broken. My daughter had to be brave enough to tell the truth before I could see it, and a dog had to help her say those words. If that's not humbling, I don't know what is." One of the men in the group, a father of two, raised his hand. "Did your daughter forgive you?" David paused. "She forgave me before I even understood what I'd done. Children have a remarkable capacity for grace, but more importantly, I've had to forgive myself, and I'm still working on that." 5 years after the court ruling, Emma's case became the subject of a documentary film. Filmmaker Reeves had initially been researching animal-assisted therapy programs when she discovered Emma's story through courthouse records. She'd reached out to Sarah, David, and Emma, all of whom agreed to participate in the project. The resulting film, titled 2 Words, premiered at the Portland International Film Festival. It told the story of a 3-year-old girl's courage, a dog's intuitive wisdom, a judge's compassionate ruling, and a family's transformation. But more than that, it told the story of a broken court system beginning to heal itself. The film won the Audience Choice Award and went on to screen at film festivals around the world. It sparked conversations about criminal justice reform, about the role of compassion in legal systems, and about animal-assisted therapy as a legitimate therapeutic intervention. But the most meaningful response came from families. Hundreds of parents, after watching the film, sought out animal-assisted therapy programs in their local courthouses. Judges began implementing the model in their own courtrooms. States began funding these programs. What had started with Scout and Officer and one brave little girl had become a national movement. 7 years after that pivotal courtroom moment, Emma turned 10 years old. Her birthday party was held at the courthouse, of all places. Judge had closed his courtroom for the afternoon, and Scout was the guest of honor. Emma wore a pink dress with flowers, the same pink as the dress she'd worn to court 7 years earlier, though now it fit a growing girl instead of a terrified toddler. Around the courtroom, balloons decorated the space where so much pain had once been processed. The families were all there. Sarah and her new partner, David, and his, a woman he'd met in his support group and found genuine connection with. The attorney, officer, judge, and Scout, who was now graying around the muzzle but still vital and present. Scout had become a mentor to 3 younger dogs, all training to follow in his paws and work with traumatized children and witnesses. His legacy was extending beyond himself. "I want to say something," Emma announced, standing in front of the assembled group. "When I was little, I couldn't talk about my feelings. I was too scared. Scout helped me. He showed me that being scared was okay and saying it out loud was even more okay. And then everyone helped me. Mommy, Daddy, Officer, Judge, my therapists. They all helped me get better. I want to be a therapist when I grow up. I want to help kids the way Scout helped me." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Scout walked over to Emma and rested his head against her leg, a gesture of affection and recognition. The dog seemed to understand that this child had grown from the terrified little girl he'd met 7 years ago into a confident, articulate, emotionally intelligent young person. Judge approached Emma and gave her a hug. "You've done more for this court system than you could possibly know," he said quietly. "You taught us all that sometimes healing is more important than winning." By the 10th anniversary of that courtroom moment, the animal-assisted therapy programs had expanded to over 200 courthouses nationwide. Thousands of traumatized children had found their voices through dogs like Scout. Families who might have remained broken had instead been guided toward healing. And the criminal justice system, incrementally but genuinely, had begun to transform. Scout eventually retired at age 12, and a statue was erected in the Portland courthouse in his honor. The plaque read, Scout, 2017-2029, a dog who understood that presence is power, that unconditional love is justice, and that sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest truth. Emma grew up to become exactly what she'd promised, a child psychologist specializing in trauma therapy. She wrote a book called The Scout Effect, about how animal-assisted therapy could transform family law. She traveled the country speaking about her experience and the importance of compassion in justice systems. But she never forgot the 3-year-old girl she'd been, the one who couldn't speak, the one whose father was drowning in unmanaged fear, the one who needed a dog to help her tell the truth. And whenever Emma met with a traumatized child in her practice, she always had the same thought. Just like Scout did for me, I can hold space for this child's truth. I can be present. I can help them find their voice. Scout had taught them all. Sometimes the greatest justice isn't about punishment. It's about transformation. It's about creating space for broken people to heal. It's about listening to the voiceless. And it's about understanding that even the smallest, most frightened child can change the world with a little help from a faithful friend.